Okay, saints, before we go on into chapter 16, I think there's something we need to see clearer, because we've been staying in this higher place, in this revelation of Yeshua the Messiah, this revelation of Jesus Christ. We've been in this higher place. But we need to dig down here a little bit and see something more clearly in chapter 15, Revelation chapter 15. 15:1, we read, "And I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels who had 7 plagues." Now that plagues there more clearly means wounds. It can mean calamity, plagues, or a wound. So we see this sign in heaven. It's great and marvelous, John said. It stood out to him. And it was 7 angels who had 7 plagues or wounds, which are the last, because in them the wrath of God is completed. So as we're going into chapter 15 now, we saw things changing to the wrath of God. We saw John say, "After these things," in verse 5. So we've changed subjects from the saints. They go into the tribulation, they get saved in the tribulation, and then they come out of the tribulation. We're now clearly leaving the saints in the tribulation and going to the wrath of God. And John now sees another sign. So we're entering into this new sign, this third sign. And it's these 7 angels who had these 7 plagues. It's a sign. It's not a clear vision. It's not something. It's a sign, a symbol, a representation of something. And in verse 6 we read, "And the 7 angels who had the 7 plagues, or the 7 wounds, came out of the temple." So these 7 angels, this sign, this symbol, represented in these 7 angels, were in the temple, because in verse 6 it says, "And the 7 angels who had the 7 plagues came out of the temple." And then we see in verse 7, "And one of the 4 living creatures gave." So these 7 angels already in this sign already had these plagues, these wounds. Because like I said, we're going to see that as we enter chapter 16. All this is going to tie together. But 15:1 said, "Which are the last." It's that continuation. And this is bringing something that's been continuing to an end. Because they are the last, because in them the wrath of God is finished. We're just entering the wrath of God. But it says in them, the wrath of God, this thing that's been played out, is going to come to an end. And where we were in verse 7, "And one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God." So these 7 angels that are this sign had these 7 plagues already. But in verse 6, the 7 angels who had the 7 plagues came out. They come out of the temple. As they come out of the temple, one of the 4 living creatures gives them the 7 bowls of the wrath of God. So in this sign, these angels, which are a sign of something, come out of the temple. One of the 4 living creatures gives them then the 7 bowls of the wrath of God. And in 15:1 again, remember, we are in this sign, and it's a great and marvelous sign. Now, where am I going with this? These 7 angels. This is all going to tie together in the next message in chapter 16, and I think it's very important we see this, because we have these 7 angels, and they're a sign, they're a type, they're a representation of something. In Revelation 8:2, we saw, "And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them." What we're going to see, saints, is that these 7 angels in Revelation 8:2, which are standing before God, are these same 7 angels here. But here they're a sign, they're a type of something that's been playing out and that's going to come to an end. And they stand before God. So that is in heaven, at the throne where John was seeing those things. And let's see here in Revelation 4:5. We're at that throne, the throne of the Father, where John is caught up into heaven. And we see his throne, and around the throne we saw in verse 4, there were 24 thrones, and upon the thrones I saw 24 elders. So there's this throne of the Father, and there's these 24 elders around it. And what do we read in verse 5? And from the throne proceeded flashes of lightning and sounds and peals of thunder. And here, saints, look at this. And there were 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. Everybody's confused about this. Are these angels? Are these spirits? Does it represent something? This is the same ones we saw that are a sign in chapter 15. They're the same ones we saw in Revelation 8:2. And I saw 7 angels who stand before God. And we're backing up here now. We're going back and seeing where we've come from. And in Revelation 4:5, and there were 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. And you say, oh, are you sure? How do you know that that's them? That says they're lamps of fire. That was 7 angels standing before God in 8:2. And sure, we can see it's a sign in chapter 15. But here it says there are 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne. And what does it say in Hebrews? Chapter 1, let's read verses 6 and 7. And when he again brings the firstborn into the world, he says, and let all the angels of God worship him. Referring to the Son, he says, let all the angels of God worship him. And in verse 7, and of the angels, he says, God says of the angels, who makes his angels spirits, he makes his angels spirits, and his ministers, referring to these angels, a flame of fire. So it says here that God has made his angels spirits, and his angels, his ministers, a flame of fire. And let's go back the other way again. Revelation 4:5 again. And there were 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. What we just read in Hebrews. And then in Revelation 8:2, it's these saints. They're the angels that are in chapter 4. It's those lamps of fire burning before the throne. And in Revelation 8:2, and I saw the 7 angels who stand before God. And then we come up where we're at in chapter 15, and I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels who had 7 plagues, which are the last, because in them the wrath of God is finished. We're going to see all this tied together. I wanted to touch upon this because chapter 16 is going to be so important to see this. So in 15:1 we have these 7 angels, which are a sign. They're a symbol. They're a type of something. Saints, they're the same 7 angels that had the 7 trumpets in Revelation 8:2. And in Revelation 8:6, and the 7 angels who had the 7 plagues came out of the temple. In 8:2, they're there before God in the temple. It has to do with the saints, the messages to the saints. Now the saints are gone. Now we're going into the wrath of God. We've left those that are saved to go into the tribulation, saved into the tribulation, and come out of the tribulation. John said after these things, we're changing things. We're now going into the wrath of God. And in verse 6 it said, and the 7 angels who had the 7 plagues came out of the temple. So those 7 angels that stood before God in Revelation 8:2 have now come out of the temple. And in verse 7 we read, and one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels, and here they're a sign, 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God. So I wanted us to see that before we go to chapter 16. These are angels. You see it in Hebrews. You see them flames of fire in Revelation chapter 4, 5. You see them in Revelation 8:2, blowing the trumpets. You see here, they're a sign, a symbol, a type of something that's been playing out and it's about to come to its end. And we will see that tied together in our next message on the book of Revelation chapter 16. It's going to be very important. It's going to tie these things together. So be ready, saints. On our next message, we'll enter this sign, this type, this symbol of something that's been playing out, that's coming to its end as we enter the wrath of God here against those who are coming against his people, his church in Israel, the congregation, the saints of Israel. That's why the wrath of God is coming. At this point, the wrath of God has to do with what the antichrist, the armies of the earth, are doing and going to be doing to the church in Israel, the congregation in Israel. That's the wrath of God that's coming at this point. And let's be ready for it.